Please join me in welcoming John F. McManus.
Thank you, David. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Delight to be in Texas. Hope the sun comes out soon. As has been the case for quite a while, it becomes obligatory on my part to start off programs with a little bit of Irish humor, as they say. The simplicity of Irish humor. The fellow riding around Ireland in an air balloon, and he got lost. He didn't know where he was. And he spied a farmer down in a potato field down here, so he lowered the balloon down, and he yelled down to the farmer in the field, "Hey," he says, "where am I?" And the Irish farmer looked up and he said, "You can't fool me, you're in that little basket up there." Well, you can't fool me, Mr. Bill Clinton. You mean to destroy the independence of the United States and the freedom of the American people, and we're not going to allow it. I'm going to presume that there are a few in this audience who are unaware of the threat to our nation and ourselves posed by the United Nations. And so at the start, therefore, I'm going to stress the fundamental and irreconcilable differences between our nation and the world government-to-be. Obviously, this will serve as a review as we get started here for some of you. And we begin with a statement, a very important statement, written by Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, number 8, in fact. He said, "Safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. Even the ardent love of liberty will, after a time, give way to its dictates," he said. "The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger, will compel the nations most attached to liberty to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free." To be more safe, many Americans in 1945 were persuaded that our nation should run the risk of being less free by joining the United Nations. We did so in 1945. The vote in the U.S. Senate was 89 in favor and only 2 opposed. One of the 2 was Senator William Langer of North Dakota. He said, "I feel from the bottom of my heart that the adoption of this charter will mean perpetuating war. It would have the authority to send our boys all over the earth. I cannot support the charter. I believe it is fraught with danger to the American people and to American institutions." He was right on target, virtually alone. The other senator was Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota, who voted against UN. In part, here's what he said. "It would be the height of folly and an enduring shame should we, the Senate of the United States, either inadvertently or through carelessness or through shirking our duty to examine and reflect, give to the American people not the bread of peace they pray for, but a stone. Not the substance of international cooperation, but the mirage of an unholy alliance of power and pelf to dominate and enslave the human race." Someday, be the good Lord willing, a monument to these 2 senators ought to be erected somewhere. I think a good place would be at present UN headquarters. After the U.S. pulls out, after the UN leaves our shores, and after the John Birch Society takes over the building for an international headquarters. Right? Curious things happened while the Senate was deliberating entry into the UN, where the matter of U.S. entry into the League of Nations back in 1919 was debated for many months and rejected. The debate about entry into the UN was rushed through in a matter of days. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana was more sharply critical of the ratification than any of his colleagues. Among the many statements he made, he said, "If we enter into this treaty, we take power away from the Congress, and the President can send troops all over the world to fight battles everywhere." But Senator Burton, he took 3.5 hours of Senate time to inform his colleagues of all the calamities that would befall the nation and the world if the UN Charter were ratified by the U.S. Senate, and then he took 1 minute to announce that he would ignore his own advice and vote for it. He said he had no alternative. He said he would take his stand when the UN came and asked for troops from America. He was never given the chance to say no. So our Senate ratified the UN Charter. The document was hammered out at a prestigious conference in San Francisco that was headed by a U.S. citizen named Alger Hiss, a communist spy loyal to the Soviet Union. Note that I said he was a U.S. citizen, not an American. There's a difference. There were nearly a score of other communists from the U.S. who our own government stated were key government figures in the planning that led to the UN, but at the time, the commitment of these people to communism wasn't known by the American people. It's also true that every communist on earth favored the creation of a world government, which they expected would be run by them, and all of these communists were eager supporters of the UN, the world government in the making that they expected to dominate. Also, there were more than 30 individuals who either were or soon would be members of the sovereignty-hating Council on Foreign Relations, who were among the U.S. delegation to the UN's founding meeting. Some prominent names there were Nelson Rockefeller, John Foster Dulles, Adlai Stevenson, and a future high official of the UN named Ralph Bunche. Let's go back to 1945 now. Let's think about this. If Hiss and all of the other Reds who were UN supporters weren't known to be communists, and if hardly anyone knew the significance of the CFR at the time, shouldn't there at least have been some concern that the Soviet Union so heavily favored the establishment of this world body? But there wasn't. Alexander Hamilton's warning that safety from external danger might lure his countrymen to turn for security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights ruled the day. Now, I doubt that 1% of Americans have ever read the UN Charter. If they did, they'd find on the very first page, Article 2, Paragraph 7, a statement that says, "Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state." Right? No nation wanted the UN meddling in their internal affairs. They were sold the UN on the promise that this was supposed to settle squabbles between nations. Well, what happened in Somalia a few years ago was entirely within the borders of Somalia, wasn't it? But the UN went there. What happened in Haiti was entirely within the borders of Haiti, wasn't it? But our presidents, first Bush, then Clinton, acting under authority they claimed they had received from UN resolutions, sent our U.S. military forces into those nations. Well, the precedent has then been set, hasn't it? What's to keep the UN from passing a resolution and sending troops from Finland and Russia or China or Iraq or Iran or wherever into our nation in response to some real or faked disturbance? We've already allowed the precedent. It could be used against us. But beyond the threat of UN action in response to matters which are so essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any nation, consider the obvious fact that the UN ignores its own charter, runs roughshod over it. The lawlessness of the UN is reason enough to fear the world body. But there's a great deal more that should be feared. In 1948, with great fanfare, the UN published its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 8 of this document states, "Everyone has the right to an effective remedy for acts violating the fundamental rights granted him by the Constitution or by law." Wait a minute. Stop. Fundamental rights granted by a Constitution or by law? Doesn't that contradict the American version of the source of fundamental rights? Anybody who's an American ought to know that the most important underpinning of this nation is the very brief phrase in the Declaration that says men are endowed by their Creator with rights, not by a Constitution, not by a law. We don't get rights from anything else but from God. In fact, nobody on earth gets rights from any place else but from the Creator. But very few have been able to enjoy those rights. If a man-made law can grant rights, another man-made law can cancel them. Or a man-made law granting them can be repealed. There is nothing more subversive of this nation's philosophical base than holding that rights come from law. Rights come from God. The UN has never acknowledged God's existence. The UN is and always has been godless. Now, further down in this highly praised Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we read that its authors give the very reason why its view of the source of rights should be feared. Article 29 of this document says, "In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law." And there you have it. Subject to limitations as determined by law. The UN Declaration states, "These rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations." In other words, the UN shall be the master. And at the UN, rights aren't granted by God, but by the UN law. Rights can be limited by the UN law, and no rights can contravene the purposes of the United Nations. This is a blueprint for tyranny. The highly praised Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now contrast all this with the marvelous Declaration of Independence. Men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And add to that the Bill of Rights, which says, Congress shall make no law regarding this one and that one and this one and this one and that one. Right? If men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, then government shall have nothing to say about them. Government to be the servant, not the master. If there were no other objections to the United Nations, what we have just discussed is more than sufficient reason to get us out. Right? Now, in tandem with this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we see in 1966 the UN published international covenants on human rights, one of which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which makes up the bulk of this booklet published by the UN. All right? Article 18, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Sounds good. Where did it come from? Well, they didn't say this time. 2 sentences later. Freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law. Over and over again. They presume to give the right, and they cancel it out in the very act of the giving. And it goes on and on. Everyone shall have the freedom of expression. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these are only such as are provided by law. And on and on. Same thing about peaceful assembly, same thing about freedom of association, and on and on. That is exactly parallel to the Constitution of the Soviet Union drawn up by Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. In the Soviet Union, the Constitution said everyone shall have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition government, all of them, except if we pass a law that says you don't. And son of a gun, they passed a law, didn't they? Right? How many people enjoyed those freedoms in the Soviet Union? We all know none. Now, I'm not alone in hearing from fellow Americans that there has to be a United Nations because there has to be a place to talk to other leaders of other nations. The argument goes, if we can't talk, we may end up fighting. And the simple answer to that, of course, is that we have ambassadors in virtually every capital city on earth. If talk is needed, it can be conducted one-on-one without involving all the other nations of the world and making whatever problem might exist even worse. But the UN is not just a talking forum. It's a world government in the making. I brought along this chart. I know that most of you can't see it. You might want to come and take a look at it. Afterwards, I'll describe it. This was produced by the United Nations in 1995 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the UN, which of course began in 1945. Now, down in the lower left-hand corner here, we see that there are international instruments, right? There are 26 of them. They're all listed there. What do we see? We see UN presence in human rights, health, trade, women, outer space, disarmament, environment, climate change, biological diversity, and much more. Right? In the lower right-hand corner here, we see UN agencies, funds, and programs. And here they are, all of these. There's 27 of these. These deal with food, atomic energy, labor, telecommunications, children, women, education, environment, drugs, population control, health, copyrights, patents, weather, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, even a United Nations university, which exists in Japan. Right? Now, doesn't all this add up to a gradual and insidious plan to take control of everyone and everything? Isn't this evidence that the UN is more than just a place to talk rather than fight? Why would the UN emblazon its own poster with "United for a Better World" if it didn't intend to unite all nations under its jurisdiction and dominate the planet? Also, the very top of this chart, note up here, it says, is my little thing working? The United Nations Global Network for Action. Not Global Network for Talk. Global Network for Action. And indeed, they mean action. Now, what's some of the action that they intend? Well, in 1992, Boutros Ghali went to the UN with his agenda for peace. They always talk about peace. And Mr. Ghali, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations, put out this long program. Excuse me. I'll read one half of one sentence. The time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty, however, has passed. Right? That's what they intend. This is an organization just for talk. You've heard that. I've heard it. Excuse me a second here. Bill, I'm glad you didn't drink all your iced tea here. My mind is way over at the other end here. The UN opposes national sovereignty. The UN wants the world united. The UN wants action, not talk. If the U.S. were to allow the UN power to unite the world under its charter, its Declaration of Human Rights, its International Covenant on Civil Rights, and all of these UN instruments, agencies, funds, and programs, what would become of the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights? They'd obviously have to be shelved, ignored, abolished. At the top of the chart here, now is one other part. We see 6 principal UN organs. And up here, we see the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Secretariat, and of pertinence to our discussion here tonight, the International Court of Justice, more commonly known as the World Court. We'll talk about this for a while, but I want to stress that the World Court is not the International Criminal Court that we'll get to. The World Court has existed since the UN was founded. It's part of the founding of the United Nations. And by virtue of our entry into the United Nations, our nation became a member of the World Court. We were not bound in any way by acceptance of authority until the Senate ratified our participation, and they did that in 1946. Enabling legislation was needed, and this is common. You sign a treaty, you bring it back, and then you need the enabling legislation by the U.S. Congress. So when the vote to join the World Court became before the Senate in 46, its jurisdiction was specifically barred from disputes, quote, which are essentially within the jurisdiction of the United States. And even that wasn't good enough for some of the wary senators, who were now getting wary. They pressured to have 6 words added to the resolution. The 6 words became known as the Connolly Reservation, named after a Texas senator named Tom Connolly, who didn't agree with what the reservation that bears his name. He knew that, however, that it had to be, or the senators wouldn't have gone along with it. Those 6 words are known as the Connolly Reservation, and they are this: as determined by the United States. So the whole thing reads, you cannot have anything to say about matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of the United States as determined by the United States. All right? But Connolly Reservation or no, submission to the world government, the World Court dictates, is voluntary. It has no enforcement arm, and this is key. The World Court has never had an enforcement arm. It is international law, something frequently talked about but rarely understood. What about international law? We have to discuss this. Thank you. The first thing that has to be known about any law is that it is of no consequence without force to back it up. That's so elementary, it hardly needs saying. And yet it does need saying. If there were no IRS to enforce its income tax laws, how many would pay what the government says they owe? Right? There has to be enforcement, or it's not really a law. The point can't be stressed too greatly. Law is nothing but talk without an enforcer, unless those who are targeted are willing to submit. And international law is no different, but it is different in this respect. If international law does have force behind it, then national sovereignty is a myth. Now let me state that another way. If there is force to back up international law, national independence doesn't exist. By its very nature, international law, as we have known it in our country, isn't compulsory. Whatever effect it has, even in a limited sense, is voluntarily accepted. Okay, now, with this in mind, it's important to note that England and other European nations, France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, Spain, Italy, all of these nations that have joined the European Union have essentially surrendered their sovereignty. They've submitted their legal systems to the European Court, which is part of this European Union, which meets in Strasbourg in France. On September 23rd, 1998, the European Court on Human Rights in Strasbourg in France ruled that a British law that allowed parents to administer corporal punishment to their own children had to be changed. Britain was fined $50,000 by this international court. A British court had previously acquitted the mother and a stepfather of charges stemming from an incident in which her 9-year-old son had received a whooping because of raising a kitchen knife to his brother. The mother insisted the boy deserved the punishment, and the British court rejected the claims of the boy's biological father and said that what was done was totally proper. After losing in the British court, the father took his case to the European court, which ruled that the British government had to pay the European court $50,000 for its trouble, pay the boy damages, and change its law. Those who once stated that the sun never sets on the British Empire have to now admit that the sun has indeed set on British sovereignty. And the British did it to themselves by joining the European Union. Great Britain, no longer great in many ways, is no longer even the master of its own fate. And this is exactly the path that our nation's leaders have laid out for us. Last July, 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices of our nation traveled to Europe to inspect this new European Court of Justice. They went to Strasbourg. Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, each of whom is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Anthony Kennedy tagged along, the 4 of them. Justice O'Connor, the senior delegate, she stated during the visit, in the next century we're going to draw upon judgments from other jurisdictions. We are going to be more inclined to look at the decisions of this European court and perhaps use some of them and cite some of them. She referred to treaties the U.S. has already submitted to, and she said we are going to see in the next century a considerable amount of litigation coming out of these treaties. Imagine a statement like that coming from someone who has sworn an oath only to the U.S. Constitution. Right? So you see, we got impeach Clinton now buttons, and we're going to have impeach Clinton Gore buttons, and then maybe impeach O'Connor buttons, and then and we're going in the button business, I think. Yeah. They all deserve it, right? But getting Bill Clinton impeached will send a shot across the bow of every one of them, and it's very, very important. If you look at it dispassionately, the term international law is a contradiction until such time as a nation is willing to submit to it. And at the point that a nation does submit to laws enforced by some other body, such a nation ceases to be a real nation in the full sense of the term. And even though the U.S. has been a member of the UN's World Court for 50 years, The UN at present has no enforcement arm to compel our nation to submit to its rulings. To date, the UN's World Court has simply been a forum for rendering opinions which can be agreed to or ignored by our nation, and we do ignore them. Last April, the World Court ruled that the United States must not allow the state of Virginia to execute a Paraguayan citizen convicted of brutally raping and murdering his victim. The receipt of the ruling from the World Court was acknowledged, but it was ignored. The Paraguayan was executed. The Associated Press, which doesn't always do it, had the story right, correct, absolutely on target. Here's what they said. The 15-judge World Court, the UN's highest judicial body, has no enforcement powers and relies on countries to comply voluntarily with its decisions. Well, good for them. But there's a tremendous move on to remove the voluntary part of membership in these treaties. The UN has always wanted power to compel nations to obey its dictates. UN officials and apologists know that this would be the culminating step in their far-advanced takeover of the planet. Let me stress that. The International Criminal Court that we will now discuss is the culminating step of over 50 years of the United Nations seeking power to force its will. It is very, very important. So after years of hoping and planning and talking and agonizing over the World Court's paper tiger inability to force its will, the UN has capitalized on the publicity about horrors perpetrated in Bosnia and Rwanda and elsewhere, and always on the continuing publicity given to the crimes of Nazi Germany 5 decades and more ago to establish the International Criminal Court, the ICC we will refer, not the Interstate Commerce Commission, right? The intention is to have the ICC empowered with compulsory jurisdiction and enforcement powers. Not a toothless world court, but an all-powerful world judiciary backed up by an all-powerful enforcement arm, which, if present trends continue, is likely going to be the United States military. Literally, something like the ICC has been a dream of UN lovers ever since the organization was begun in 1945. In 1954, for instance, Michigan Senator Homer Ferguson introduced a resolution in the U.S. Senate, called for 4 major changes in the U.S. attitude toward the UN and the UN itself. He wanted removal of the veto possessed by the 5 permanent Security Council members. He wanted the creation of a standing UN military arm. He wanted taxing power for the world body, and he wanted an international criminal court. He said that in 1954. In 1993, Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut, Council on Foreign Relations, introduced a measure in the U.S. Senate calling for the creation of an international criminal court to combat unlawful acts such as, quote, war crimes, genocide, aggression, terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, and other crimes of an international character. Wow. And that great humanitarian, Mikhail Gorbachev, spoke in favor of adding ecological crimes to the ICC's jurisdiction. The great humanitarian, right? The man who, as the leader of the Soviet Union, presided over the murder of 1.4 million Afghan civilians in the 1980s. His troops dropped booby-trapped toys in the nation. Youngsters picked them up and had their hands blown away, their eyes and face marred. Just a horrible crime. The man is an arch criminal, welcomed at the United Nations, standing ovation, welcomed at the U.S. Congress, standing ovation. What a world we're living in. And so during most of 1998, conferences promoting the idea of this UN International Criminal Court were held in the United States and elsewhere. President Clinton has favored the idea since he set foot in the White House. In February, a gathering in Los Angeles heard a Clinton appointee named David Sheffer, also of the CFR, state, "We believe that a core purpose of an international criminal court must be to impose a discipline of law enforcement upon national governments." Impose a discipline of law enforcement upon national governments. Right. The U.S. military has already pointed out The danger of having this happen, the U.S. military has said that troops overseas in UN peacekeeping adventures could be charged by individuals in those nations with one of these crimes. A Pentagon briefing was held earlier this year. The Pentagon brought in military attachés from all around the globe to Washington to tell them about this and to warn them about it and to let their leaders in the executive branch know that the military wasn't happy about this. In like manner, local officials and police officers could be hauled before the International Criminal Court based either on charges from foreign individuals or even by persons within the United States. Consider what charges might come out of actions taken in the U.S. against rioters and looters and suspected terrorists and others. In fact, such charges have already been aired over the years. In 1951, the Civil Rights Congress, a cited Communist Front organization, charged President Truman and other administration officials with genocide against American blacks. In 1969, an attorney for the Black Panthers suggested that genocide was behind the killing of Black Panthers in a shootout with police in California. During the Vietnam War, a war crimes tribunal in Europe formally charged the U.S. with genocide because of the activities of the U.S. military in Southeast Asia. So I'm not making these things up. Had the ICC been in existence during these years, had it assumed or been given world jurisdiction, and had these charges been made before it, U.S. officials, military men, would have been liable for prosecution in a foreign land under rules which do not recognize the rights of individuals contained in the American legal system and enshrined in the Bill of Rights. As to what kind of prosecution they would have been subjected to, listen carefully to what is now happening at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, because it is intended to be a model for the UN's International Criminal Court. All right, what's happening there? No trial by jury of peers, no right to confront accusers, no bail, no speedy trial, no presumption of innocence, judges and prosecutors answerable to no one, judges from any nation whatsoever, part of the panel. They could come from Cuba, the Sudan, China, Iran, Iraq. If you're convicted, you can appeal before the same tribunal. Trial in a foreign nation, jail in a foreign nation. In short, ladies and gentlemen, tear up the Bill of Rights, be prepared for a world-class kangaroo court with enforcement powers. As Professor Charles Rice of Notre Dame Law School has said, the International Criminal Court repudiates the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and cancels the 4th of July. The U.S. Constitution, of course, grants authority to our government to establish judicial power, as it says, that shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. One Supreme Court, inferior courts, which are the federal district courts. This does not include subjecting the American people to the dictates of some international court. They have no authority in the Constitution to do it, but of course, what's the Constitution to these people? When our nation separated from England, the marvelous Declaration of Independence spelled out an array of offenses committed by the British Crown. Most of the Declaration is an indictment. We're separating because of this, and this. Well, here's some of the thises. He, the king, has combined with others to subject us to jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to acts of pretended legislation. There it is. He said we're separating because he has deprived us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. We're separating because he's transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses. History does repeat for those who don't know its clear lessons. Let's not let this happen to us. And so the International Criminal Court was formally convened, formally established at a conference held in Rome, Italy during June and July of this year. Representatives of 160 nations met at the huge headquarters of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. And representatives from 120 of those nations approved the proposal, with only 7 nations rejecting the idea. Now, as a side, just consider the fact that they gathered delegations from 160 nations. They had delegations from scores of what are called the UN's non-governmental organizations, NGOs. They had media representatives from many parts of the world. They had all kinds of people in this building. And you can get an idea of the size of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization from the fact that this enormous gathering fit very nicely into its auditorium, right? What might that Food and Agriculture Organization have in mind down the road? Controlling food and agriculture for mankind? Yes, yes. Yeah, it's far more than just an organization for talk, right? So 120 nations said yay, 7 nations said no. Surprisingly, one of those 7 was the United States. We rejected it, not because we disapproved of the plan, but because we wanted it fine-tuned. Right? Our representative objected only to details involving possible targeting of our military, possible creation of a permanent independent prosecutor's office, and the court's claim of jurisdiction over signatories in citizens in a non-signatory country. Our chief ambassador to this conference, David Sheffer, announced that the U.S. very much favors the idea. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright continues vigorously to advocate the establishment of the International Criminal Court. You pick up the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a lot of these newspapers, and you see editorials saying, what happened? Why don't we get involved in this? Let's go. Other U.S. leaders have expressed hopes that the U.S. will join the ICC in the near future. The real reason for caution by our own delegates was their certainty that the U.S. Senate would not ratify the proposal, thereby embarrassing the administration. Thereby embarrassing the administration. Relations Committee Jesse Helms has emphatically stated that the treaty would be dead on arrival at his panel if it does not contain a veto power over its ability to pluck U.S. citizens out of wherever and send them on trial in a foreign nation. Now that sounds reassuring, but there are reasons why such an attitude really isn't any guarantee against ICC power that is sought by these people. History has repeatedly shown that proponents of numerous dangerous measures have regularly been more than willing to accept seemingly crippled proposals in order to get something on the books and then have it improved at a later date. Right? I'll give you 6 examples of this. I want to drive this point home very, very emphatically. In 1913, backers of legislation to create the Federal Reserve actually stated their intention to, quote, get the bill passed, we'll perfect it later. Historians have noted that Fed architects Edward Mandell House and Paul Warburg feared that if they waited until they had everything they wanted, they'd get nothing. So they worked for passage of a weak measure and then arranged to strengthen it later to become the absolute controller of the U.S. economy. Perfect example of what I'm trying to say. How about the federal income tax? When it was proposed, its backers said it would never exceed 5%, it would target only the very rich. The first income tax, 80 years ago, was 1% on the extremely wealthy. Has it risen? The process known as withholding tax was roundly rejected in 1941. But it was begun after World War II started as a temporary war measure, and 1 year later it was made permanent. If the American people had to dig deeply every April to pay what the government demands from their incomes, the income tax would never have risen to the heights that it is. A couple more examples. Federal involvement in medicine was only going to be for the aged, and look where it is today. The EPA was never going to become a draconian controller of business and industry, but it is. Federal aid to education was never going to lead to federal control or to the end of prayer in the schools, the teaching of sex education, homosexual acceptance, and so on, but this is where we are. They got it on the books, they improved it later. So yes, the U.S. delegate voted against the creation of the International Criminal Court. But the ICC claims that it will begin functioning when the legislatures of a mere 60 nations formally approve measures. See, the 120 approved it at the conference, then it goes back to the 120 legislatures for ratification. Well, if 120 voted for it in Rome, I don't think getting 60 is going to be any real obstacle. What's also interesting is that the decision regarding the need for 60 formal ratifications was the ICC's decision alone. They actually debated the matter. Well, do we need 90 or do we need 30 or do we need 120 or do we need that? Oh, well, 60 is a good number. Let's go for 60. During the Rome conference, when the ICC was formalized, delegates were repeatedly told that additions to its charter would be made after it was established, just as so often has been done with other dangerous initiatives. Even worse, and here's perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this proposal, the ICC claims that once it obtains those 60 ratifications, it will have jurisdiction over everyone, including citizens of nations that are not party to the treaty. It will target every person on Earth, every area of the planet. Dr. Charles Rice says the ICC has no legitimate basis for its claimed authority, no protections against abuse of its assumed powers, no accountability, and virtually no limits on its jurisdiction. Well, Senator Helms came back more recently and he expressed his complete opposition to it. No qualifications this time. That's good. We're glad to hear it. Some people in North Carolina probably got after him. He said the UN and the ICC, if it gets it, will supply the UN with a principal trapping of sovereignty. That's right. He said the UN is not now, nor will ever be, so long as I have breath in me, a sovereign entity. He suggests that our nation renegotiate status of forces treaties with any nation that signs this treaty and has U.S. military personnel stationed within its borders. Well, that's a good idea. Wouldn't it even be better to just bring our troops home from everywhere? Right? So let's look at the document itself. This is the statute of the International Criminal Court. Right? Philadelphia lawyers can line up and borrow it. Right? Article 17 says, a state, and by that they mean a nation, will have primary jurisdiction over a crime unless the state is unwilling or unable genuinely to carry out the investigation or prosecution. Article 120 says, no reservations may be made to this statute. You want to ratify it? You nation, you go ahead ratify it. You can't make any reservations to it. Article 59. A state party which has received a request for provisional arrest or for arrest and surrender shall immediately take steps to arrest the person in question. Note, shall immediately. Also, Article 59. It shall not be open to the competent authority of the custodial state to consider whether the warrant of arrest was properly issued. In other words, if the ICC issues a warrant for arrest, no one shall dare contest it. Now, as for definitions of the crimes the ICC intends to prosecute, there aren't any real or precise definitions to speak of. In 1986, courtesy of Ronald Reagan and the Senate, our nation approved the UN's Genocide Convention as a dangerous pact that should never have been ratified. But the definition of genocide in that convention was so loose that the Senate added 2 reservations, 5 understandings, and 1 declaration. If the Senate should ever ratify U.S. participation in the ICC, it would have to repudiate the positions it took relative to the Genocide Convention, and no reservations are allowed. So what are the crimes? Genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity to start with. And that makes people think of Hitler, Bosnia, Rwanda. But genocide has been defined in part as causing mental harm, an ethnic joke. ICC judges will determine a supposed victim's, quote, emotional reaction to a deed, an entirely new legalism. Constitutional authorities have looked this thing over and they have warned. They say that the ICC is targeting enforced pregnancy. What the heck is enforced pregnancy? Well, that's very easy. Enforced pregnancy is if you're opposed to abortion on demand. You're guilty of enforced pregnancy. The ICC is criminalizing the denial of homosexual marriage. The ICC will criminalize religions that treat women differently than men. The Catholic Church, for instance, doesn't ordain women. It will be targeted. The ICC will criminalize what it believes to be a negation of its own definition of the best interests of the child. Wide open. Ladies and gentlemen, ultimately what we see here is the United Nations International Criminal Court will criminalize opposition to the United Nations. Add to all of this the certainty that all bureaucracies expand their coverage, their activity, their list of opponents. The authority assumed by the International Criminal Court gives it the opportunity to go after whatever and whomever it wants to target, and the UN means to wield this weapon with a vengeance. There's been a lot in the press lately about hate crimes. By definition, punishing someone for a hate crime isn't punishing for the act alone. It's punishing a person for what he's thinking. Sensible justice punishes for acts, not for thoughts. But those who want the ICC would love to include the undefinable hate crimes under their umbrella of jurisdiction, and that would let loose an international thought police. In 1785, James Madison, the father of the U.S. Constitution, urged Americans to, quote, take alarm at the first experiment upon our liberties. He reminded his countrymen that the free men of America did not wait until usurped power had strengthened itself in the exercise. They detected the abuses in principle, and they prevented the abuses by denying the principle. Applying that superb advice to today's situation, Madison would say that we dare not wait until Americans are carted off to some ICC tribunal in a far-off country before we protest. The time to protest is now, as soon as the dangerous principles undergirding this monster are understood. And the protest should include no international criminal court for the United States. But some will say there are prominent Americans who support the idea. The American Bar Association supports it. Big surprise there, huh? The huge environmental groups favor it. Feminist groups, religious groups, peace groups, huge foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, international corporations, Sony, Volkswagen, pro-abortion groups are lined up in support. Intellectual support comes from the Council on Foreign Relations. And of course, the World Federalist Association supports the creation of this. That organization has no use for U.S. sovereignty, fairly open about it. It's been working to undermine it for years. In December of 1985, a vice president of the World Affairs Association named John Logue was called before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Tell us what you're looking for, Mr. Logue. And he referred to himself and his fellow internationalists as peace people, and here's what he said. Yes, peace people must stop patronizing the people of the world. It's time to tell the world's people not what they want to hear, but what they ought to hear. And what they ought to hear is that if we really want to have peace and promote justice, we must reform, restructure, and strengthen the United Nations and give it the power and authority and funds to keep the peace and promote justice. The Security Council veto must go. One nation, one vote must go. The United Nations must have taxing power, a dependable source of revenue. It must have a large peacekeeping force. It must be able to supervise the dismantling and destruction of weapons in appropriate areas, particularly the area of peace and security. Get this. It must be able to make and enforce law on the individual. That was 1985. And that's what the International Criminal Court is all about. Enforcing its version of law on the individual. That's what the ICC will be able to bring about if it ever reaches the goals its creators have set for it. Those goals, as we noted previously, include such provisions as no trial by jury of peers, no right to confront accusers, no bail, no speedy trial, no presumption of innocence, judges and prosecutors answerable to no one, judges from any nation whatsoever. If convicted, you can appeal before the same body. Trial in a foreign nation, jail in a foreign nation. The International Criminal Court must be completely repudiated and kept from having any influence over our nation, including the use of our military personnel as its enforcement arm. So everyone in this audience and lots of other audiences must decide to become conversant with this monster. It must be opposed. I can't do the job alone. Your help is needed. But stopping the ICC from having any influence over America is only part of the job that needs to be accomplished. Our nation must lead the world back to sanity by withdrawing completely from the world body. Let the cry be, get us out of the United Nations. And if you want to add... and if you want to add to that, get the United Nations out of the United States, you'll get no argument from me, right? In 1997, a very courageous congressman from the great state of Texas, Ron Paul, introduced a bill to get us out at the beginning of that session, and it's a session about to conclude. He gathered some sponsors, some co-sponsors, and then in a brilliant maneuver, he added his entire bill as an amendment to the State Department authorization measure. Presto, it came for a vote, and 54 members of the House voted yes, get us out. I was stunned. I never thought they'd get that many. Neither did he. The vote was actually the first time in 50-plus years of our membership in the UN that the Congress actually expressed itself formally on the matter. Ron Paul told me personally that several more members of the House came to him after the vote and said that they're beginning to think this was a good idea and they'd probably be with him when they get a chance to vote on this next time. The Get Us Out bill will be introduced next year at the beginning of the new congressional session, and it's up to you to make sure your representative in the House is a supporter, a co-sponsor, even an enthusiastic supporter and protector of U.S. independence by working to get us out. Your House members should hear from you on that. Your senators too. But your senators should hear from you on this proposal for the International Criminal Court, because if it comes to them, it would not have to go to the House. Decide right now. You're going to be in touch with each of your senators and lay plans to spread the alarm throughout your circle of influence. Your message need be very simple. Don't even think about submitting the United States to the UN's International Criminal Court. And we've got some excellent tools to help you with this program. We have two recently produced video programs, each of them 30 minutes long. The first is called United Nations, A Look into the Future, and it describes what the world will be like in the future if the UN is not stopped. It states very emphatically and very clearly that many Americans involved in worthy special interest groups had better help us get out of the UN or their fight is over. What special groups are we talking about? Well, the groups fighting for life in the womb, the groups fighting for gun ownership, private and home school freedom, property rights, religion, you name it. Everything is targeted by the United Nations, which is pro-abortion, pro-gun confiscation, pro-education monopoly, pro-takeover of property, pro its own world religion, they actually have started that, etc., etc. 26 international instruments, 27 agencies, funds, and programs, and a lot more coming. And in this video, the experts who present this view come from the pro-life movement, come from the pro-gun movement, come from all of the different movements we've talked about, the homeschool, private school movement, and so forth, in addition to our own people, and Ron Paul's in the video giving a very profound statement about get us out. The second of the two videos, more recently produced, again only 30 minutes, called Injustice for All, the International Criminal Court. Constitutional experts are in this video talking about the danger of this. Charles Rice is in here, a Yugoslav immigrant named Tripkovic, another one named Kostas. Our own experts on the subject, Will Grigg and Bill Jasper, are in that video. And it dwells on the grave threat posed by the International Criminal Court. Now, I contend that the bringing of this to prominence, the potential that this might become part of our American system, we might submit to it and so forth, is a very grave threat, but it is a grand opportunity. Right? I contend that people, when they understand this, will say to themselves, now I know what you're talking about when you say why we have to get out of the United Nations. You can take these two videos, you can sit down anybody for just an hour, play one, have a cup of coffee, play the other. You're out of there in an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes. You can do all kinds of good with this. I think everyone in the room knows somebody in the pro-life movement, the pro-gun movement, the pro-homeschool, private school movement, the independent religions, maintain the integrity of our own military under U.S. control. It's all in these videos. And you can sit down, the leaders of these groups say, look, I just need an hour of your time. After you finish showing the two videos, you say, how about if we show this to your group? You'll be able to do that. See, the John Birch Society over the years has been told by many, many people, especially new members come in, why don't we form a coalition with all these other groups and all fight together and so on and so on. We've spent 40 years doing that and 40 years pulling knives out of our backs. Believe me. We'll do what we can in that regard, but you folks at the local level can do it and do it far easier because you're not dealing with fakers and phonies. You're dealing with honorable people who are interested in pro-life, pro-gun, pro-school, and so on. You can do it at the local level. Do it. Do it as if your life depended on it, because it does. It does. Now, as we showed on the UN's own chart, this world organization has established its presence in every area of life. It means to control everyone and everything. And James Madison said that the time to prevent abuses directed at freedom is not after the abuses have become common, not after the freedom has been taken away, but when the very principle upon which they are falsely justified is established. The UN is not just a talking forum. 26 international instruments, 27 agencies, funds, and programs, 6 UN organs, and at the top of the chart we see a global network for action. The curtailment of national independence, the termination of personal freedom is staring us in the face. But it's not too late to deny the principle and protect our freedom, and use this situation as an opportunity to get us out. Now, when the men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 read the Declaration of Independence, they knew that it spelled treason to the king. They knew that signing it was the equivalent of signing a death warrant for themselves. And so a murmur went through the room. Some of them thought about their family, their wives, their children, their aged parents, what might happen to them. Some thought about the might of the British Army, the largest, the most well-equipped in the world, as opposed to the small and ill-equipped force that could be mustered here. Some wondered if it were really the right time to take such a bold step. And John Adams was there, and I'm told that he rose and he addressed his fellow patriots as follows. If it be the pleasure of heaven that my country shall require the poor offering of my life, the victim shall be ready, he said. But while I do live, let me have a country, or at least the hope of a country, and that a free country. Whatever may be our fate, however, be assured this declaration will stand. It may cost treasure, it may cost blood, but it will richly compensate for both. And live or die, he said, survive or perish, I am for the Declaration. It is my living sentiment, and by the blessing of God it shall be my dying sentiment, independence now and independence forever. And they signed. And they launched the greatest experiment in human liberty in all history, the United States of America, our country. The nation which practically all of us were born into with absolutely no effort on our part. We were, those who were born here, very lucky to have been born an American. Are we going to let it slip away to a godless tyranny in the making? Or are we going to pass it on to those who will come after us? Don't we owe something to those who sacrificed everything to give us this wonderful country? I can think of all kinds of reasons to be involved. And so right now, not tomorrow, not next week, not when you have some extra times, right now your country needs you. If you're involved, God bless you. If not, get involved. Commit yourself tonight to do it. Decide right now you'll do everything you can to restore full independence by forcing our leaders to get us out. Purchase both of these videos. Start sharing them with people. Start going to these different groups. Get the literature at the back of the table and put it to work. And best of all, sign up in the John Birch Society. Far and away, the nation's leader in returning this nation to its glorious roots. That's the real answer. This is an organized conspiratorial drive to steal our independence and to take away our personal freedom. An organized conspiratorial drive has to be opposed by organized good. Can't do it by yourself. I can't. Nobody in the room can, but together we can. Together we can, with organization that knows the enemy, has the track record, can demonstrate that it's been on target, on target, on target, again and again and again. All we need is more muscle, more members, more resources. We can turn this whole thing around and reestablish this nation. There's our message. And so I'll end by saying God bless all of you. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it very much. Now, let's get to work. And we close with a fervent prayer that God will continue to bless and protect the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. McManus, for your highly informative speech about the ICC. I'm sure all of us now have a much better understanding of the issues that you outlined and the implications to us as individuals. In concluding, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask you a few questions. What are we going to do? What are we going to do here in the Dallas area? What are we going to do to reach our neighbors and our friends? How are we going to work together in order to put a stop to the ICC mentioned tonight? Well, there's a sheet being passed around right now that can get you on your way to helping. The sheet will make available to you some upcoming video showings on the International Criminal Court that you can bring your guests and your friends to, presentations on the John Birch Society, and give the opportunity to join the John Birch Society and get involved in a local action, in local action here. So we ask you to take a moment now, if you will, and fill out the sheet, and the ladies and the gentlemen will come around and pick them up before we adjourn tonight. But this will get you on your way on stopping the tyranny that we're faced with and promoting our American principles. You also find on your table a Stop the ICC Action flyer. Please take that home and duplicate that with you and get it out to your friends and your neighbors. Take it to your church. And the two videos that Jack McManus mentioned tonight on the United Nations and the ICC, see if you can get those set up in your church, in your civic club, and in your political organizations and groups you belong to also. The ICC is a part of an international conspiracy for global control through the United Nations. We have spoken out very forcefully against the United Nations and against the ICC and the John Birch Society. October 24th is United Nations Day. Please remember that. Put a bumper sticker on your car to get us out of the United Nations. Wear one of the Stop the UN pins to work that day, and pick up some of these little brochures you'll find in the back table, a dozen good reasons to get us out of the United Nations, and distribute them to your coworkers and your friends on October the 24th. You'll find the videos on the back table. You'll also find our latest book that we have just published through Robert Welsh University, called Philip Drew Administrator, the most influential political tract of the 20th century. An insider tells about his plans for world power that was very close to President Woodrow Wilson, an insider called E. Mandel House. He wrote this in fiction form, but he meant business. He was talking about himself in ruling the world and how they were going to do it. And you'll see the groundwork being laid for the conspiracy that we're faced with today. There are a number